there's one comment that I thought I would share with you with respect to a number of social and economic issues facing modern Muslim society. Most of the discourse with respect to these issues is approached usually from people who come from a secular background and who make arguments which are grounded in sociological observations or sociological method or economic observations, economic methods, economic theories. And what reformers wish to accomplish invariably faces a very difficult obstacle in the Muslim world because of very entrenched Muslim doctrine. And in my opinion, there is insufficient effort being made to deal with Muslim traditional doctrine in relationship to these issues. There's a lack, if you will, of legal imagination by jurists who could then take a fresh look at the way the Sharia has been interpreted. And so, rather than opposing the Sharia, to use imaginative arguments. And let me give you an example. When we were talking about the verse in the Quran that dealt with the permission of marrying 1, 2, 3, or 4, وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ, that's another question, but we'll leave that. And then it adds, provided that you are fair and equal, and then it adds, but since you will not be fair and equal, and shall not, لَن تَعْدَلُوا. Len in Arabic is called harf nahi, which means it's an impossibility. So one thinks, well, how do you approach this thing? Well, let me offer you a way jurists would approach it. Well, the early jurists who were in favor of polygamy, because it was also practiced in the Jahiliyyah, simply said, well, let's use a basic contract law approach. You know, a contract is an agreement between two parties. And in every contract, you have condition precedent and a condition subsequent. So the jurist will say, well, you know, the marriage contract for 1, 2, 3, and 4 is valid. The only thing you need to do is fulfill a condition subsequent. Well, if you don't fulfill the condition subsequent, it does not invalidate the contract. What it does is simply say you are at fault with something subsequent, but the contract is valid. Now, my imaginative approach to getting around that is to say, no, no, no. This is not a condition subsequent. This is a condition precedent. You have to be able to guarantee full equality, and the verse says, you will not be able to, and you shall not be able to. Therefore, the condition precedent itself invalidates the contract. It would be as if saying, you can enter a contract provided you're 21 years of age. If you're 19, you cannot enter the contract. It is a condition precedent. You will not find a lot of these imaginative arguments. Same thing with inheritance. You know, we can't go and say, oh, the verse in the Quran that says, وَلِلذَّكَرْ مِثْلَ حَظَّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ, that is, the male is going to inherit twice the female. It's not going to go against it. But if you say that the purpose of this difference and, you know, the siyasat al-sharia, the purpose of the sharia, the legal policy of the Sharia is because the Sharia placed an obligation on the brother to take care of the sister. Well, you know, the answer is very simple. You simply displace that obligation by saying from now on, the state will assume the obligation. So each one of them takes the equal share, or we will tax the male twice as much as we tax the female. We take the money, put it in a special funds for social security and welfare benefits for women, and you've solved the problem. We're not attacking the verse. We're not going against the specific statement of the Quran. We find a method of interpretation which is consonant with traditional doctrine in Sharia interpretation and reach a different conclusion. Not enough of that is being done. And I see a lot of reformist Muslim scholars in the field of social and economic fields trying to make contemporary social arguments, whereas in reality what we need to do is to re-examine traditional Sharia interpretation doctrine and use traditional methods, not discard them, as a lot of reformers do and say, well, this is no good, you know, doesn't correspond to modern times. That's not the way to do it. Follow the traditional way, you can get around the problem and reach a satisfactory solution. So I urge you to think about that in connection with a variety of social issues which face an organization like the HIZMET movement. Well, our next speaker, Gokhan Bacik, is from Zirve University from Turkey, and he will speak to us about Islamic movements and Amodern networks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it's also my pleasure to be here. Well, actually, the first speaker's second finding is very much about my presentation, that she was saying about that movement is neither modern nor traditional. So I will try to bring the idea of a modernity in explaining the movement, Gülen movement. And before doing this, let me clarify why I have chosen this keyword. While reading some texts written by Gülen, I have recognized that I can't understand them. Or in other words, they are simply meaningless from a modernist perspective. So I try to understand why or what is the alternative meaning behind these things. This brought me to a kind of comparative reading between Gülen and the canons of Islamic philosophy, such as Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and other stuff. So I discovered that just like many of the canons of Islamic philosophy, Gülen also is employing a different, let's say, linguistic methodology. This brought me to the idea of a modernity. So I argue that in explaining the Gülen movement in terms of how it employs different structures, because when we talk this movement, we mean that it's operating around the globe, which means that we are living in the era of nation states. We have boundaries, different borders that separates nations from each other, but it is still operating in different countries such as Macedonia, Madagascar, Nigeria. So the first question is how it is possible, how it is effective in such a boundary-based modern state system. The second question is, again, about the idea of Amodern, how some non-material ideas such as legitimacy, knowledge, and epistemologic forms are being produced. I argue that the study of the HIZMET movement or the Gülen movement from the perspective of Amodernity can help us to understand why it is operational in such different environments, how it is coping with the idea of modern. But before, let me clarify what I mean by Amodern. First of all, by Amodern, I mean to the traditional networks, symbols, values, patterns, and cognitive forms that was created by Islamic civilization well before modernity. The first point about is that a modern approach rejects that there is no perfect match between modernity and social life, because modern philosophy says to us, modernity explains and covers every aspect of life. If you criticize that, you are going to face two guardians of this temple. One is modern science, the other is modern state. But a modernity believes that there are different aspects of human life which is being still practiced by these amodern patterns and cognitive forms. The second is there is no binary reading between amodern and modern, which means that amodern is not the opposite of modern. It is irregular, or by paraphrasing Arendt here, amodern is disinterested in modern, which means that on some issues they agree, on some issues they disagree, or sometimes they agree, but soon after they can also be in conflict with each other. The third point is, amodernity rejects the historiographic reading of past. Modernity is past. In other words, according to amodernity, it is not correct to use or to label the things which took place, such as the Islamic civilization, as pre-modern, because pre-modern means that it is something that ended in some specific period of time. So in amodern, no, it is still going on. Actually, in the beginning I said the canons of Islamic civilization or Islamic philosophy to a large extent are representing this amodern tradition which perceives the social and natural phenomena from a holistic approach. But to find out an intellectual trace in Western thinking, I think along with this orthodox philosophical tradition of Aristotle, which brings Kant, Hegel, so on and so forth, I think there is another. So amodernity is about the second approach, which can be named as the heterodox tradition of rationalist theory, which may cover Leibniz, Spinoza, and Bergson, this kind of stuff. So by amodernity, I'm trying to make a kind of connection between the canons of Islamic philosophy and this heterodox ontological tradition in the Western philosophical thoughts. The problem about amodern networks of Islam is they were rejected by the modernized elites of Islamic world. So in many Islamic states, including Turkey, we have these radical modernization agendas. So the elites came up with the idea that we no longer recognize them. It was a kind of official rejection, which doesn't necessarily mean that their rejection entailed that they were no longer practically effective. But in the Gülen case, while analyzing how such a movement can be operational in different societies, even though they are, they are separated according to modern boundaries, I find out that the movement operates mainly through these amodern networks. So these amodern networks actually is an operational corridor for the movement. Second, they are also a kind of source of security and legitimacy. So at this point, I think it is better to ask how does Gülen approach to modernity in general? As I represent him as the representative of modernity, first of all, there is no direct rejection of modernity, but it is a kind of negotiating with modernity. Negotiation refers that it is not only moral-based criticism. For example, to give a quite famous or infamous sample, many Islamic scholars around the globe are, even though they have a message in content which criticize modernity, they are product of modernity. For example, Ayatollah Khomeini is a typical modernist Islamic scholar, because when you come up with the idea of modern state, it is another version of modernity. The idea of Islamic state, in fact, shows how the modernization affects, including Islamic elites, so far as to include Ayatollah Khomeini. Even from another perspective, for example, the idea of Islamic law is a modern concept. Thinking from a modern perspective, I mean referring to the canons of Islamic philosophy, I don't think it is possible to talk about an Islamic law. There are different approaches, but I think trying to put them under the umbrella of Islamic law is another modern naming or discourse. So in this case, Gülen is not criticizing modernity on the basis of morality like other guys, but also maybe he criticized modernity in terms of morality, but more important is he reminds the existing patterns of Islamic civilization, which are still effective up and onto the Muslim community. Here, another interesting point that I want to emphasize, the influence of modern education. I remember Gilles Kepel saying that most of the Islamic scholars are coming from modern educational background. As far as I know, for example, Mr. Erbakan of Turkey is an engineer. Sayyid Qutb has I think, journalist background education. What is the meaning of coming from a modern education? I think this point is important. Compared with the scholars, there are two important points I can talk about as the roots of a modernity in Fethullah Gülen. The first is the madrasa education. Per se, Gülen is not the product of modern education. I should here refer to his madrasa-style education in Erzurum, which is quite important because despite the radical modernization of Turkey in 1930s and 40s, there was still a well-established madrasa education in Erzurum, which should be seen as the basis of Gülen's early intellectual socialization. So many other Islamic scholars coming from modern education, and of course this affects their understanding of social phenomena as well as the other things. So in Erzurum, in well-established madrasa institutions, Gülen was taught by several Islamic scholars. Let me count some of them: Molla Halil, Vehbi Efendi, Zirve Efendi. This is important because all these guys did write their books according to traditional Islamic logic, not modern way. They were not modern. I read some of their books. As a serious difference, in traditional ulema or usul, the agent, when you analyze this book, you come up with a question. What is the agent for change? What is the agent for Islamic mission in these books? It is not the government. It is not the state. Even in these books, we don't have such ideas such as state, territory, or national identity. For example, when you read Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, you will never come up with the ideas of nationhood, territory, so on and so forth. These are all products of modernity. So in these writings, I discovered that the main agent of Islamic activism is ulema. Ulema is given. And in these books, like its predecessors in the pre-modern, let's say, in terms of historiography, canons of Islamic literary tradition, the topoi, I mean the epistemologic area that this agent was appointed to act is not government or a constituency, it is daily life. So briefly, in this madrasa education, Gülen was taught that, according to usul of the traditional Islam, where two concepts were underlined. One is ulema as the main agent of change, not the prime minister, not the government, so on and so forth. The second is the operational corridor for this activism is not political process, but it is daily Islam. So I think this educational background enabled Gülen with the discursive capacity to speak all other Islamic groups through traditional networks. I have made some field studies in different countries among the Muslim community in Cairo, in South Africa, and I can say that I could easily recognize how the Gülen movement speaks and acts through these Amodern networks with those people. Because when you act through these operational corridors, you are not seen as the representative of modern institutions or boundaries such as government or state. Instead, you are seen as the representative of these global Islamic networks. So, in terms of these points, another case is the childhood socialization as a second root of a modern trait of Gülen movement. It is the early socialization of, again, Fethullah Gülen. Again, I should refer to his life, his socialization in Erzurum. 1930s and 40s should be named as the, as I said in the beginning, as the rapid and dramatic or radical modernization of Turkey. But Erzurum, in terms of its geographical and social, I should say, configuration, was relatively free from this rapid urbanization. So the effects of rapid urbanization in Ankara, in other urban centers of Turkey, did not affect Gülen. So I can argue that, to a large extent, also his childhood socialization took place in a society, in a daily life, where these facts were highly effective. Now, let me, after this introduction, focus on how modern networks help the movement. I find out several facts to explain how the modern networks are being employed by the movement, but in the interest of time, I am just focusing 4 of them. The first is security. As we all know, since Bauman, modernity is about these boundaries. The modern notion of security is about these institutions and boundaries. In other words, modernity has an obsessed idea of security which is very linked with the institutional aspect. So it means that the lexicon of modernity is to a large extent defined according to government, state, territory, homeland, so on and so forth. But in this case, the movement, while it acts not according to these prioritized and highly critical boundaries, but through daily life, the movement is never seen as a threat to modernity, which is something very good. It's not risking, but on the other hand, it creates its own security mechanism. Because since it is indifferent to modernity, when you read, for example, Gülen, such institutional aspects as city, civilization, state is never appreciated. It is quite important. We know many Islamic scholars who do not pay attention to the idea of state, but most of them appreciate city and civilization. But in Gülen, interestingly, even such institutional things are not appreciated. In other words, in Gülen's thought, these institutional aspects of modernity, I'm keeping city and civilization far from this, are seen things without ontological nature. So when the movement operates out of these areas, the mechanism of modernity to see it as a kind of security threat is not working. This is something good. The second point is, modern networks protect the movement from nationalist reaction. For example, from a Turkish perspective, it is very difficult to explain why this movement is very, very successful in Kurdistan regional government. Because the political atmosphere in Turkey, I mean, including some parts of Turkey, is very, very sensitive about this case. But the movement is very, very, very successful in Kurdish regional government area. I may give some other examples as well. The answer is very, 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 from this perspective, clear. The movement, by again employing these traditional networks, never employs nationalistic discourse. I should refer here to Muhammad Ayyub's findings that many Islamic movements are in fact nationalist movements because they are either product of anti-nationalist struggle or so on and so forth. But when you make a comparative study, you will find out that in many Islamic movements, there is the idea of creating an Islamic state, or at least mainly because of the legacy of colonial rule, the idealism of having our own state, but which means another aspect of modernization. So in this case, by acting through these traditional modern operational corridors, the movement is not seen as a representative of a certain nationalistic discourse. That is why there are serious problems between Turks and Kurds, the movement is highly successful in Kurdistan. And the third point is, I should also talk about how a modern network sustains legitimacy to the movement. Because if a network sustains a legitimacy, its members has it in the same way. And again, these networks do not represent the representative of the movement. Let me say it functionally, or the agent of the Gülen movement. Imagine yourself as the agent of the Gülen movement in Madagascar. You are going to face a community, you don't know, no idea about their culture, so there's a problem of being stranger. Why these people are not seen as stranger? Because, as we know, since again Bauman, modernity, while creating its boundaries, creates the idea of strangers as the dominant category to understand other. So how come the functionaries or the agents of the movement are not seen as strangers? It is mainly these modern network, especially among Islamic community, so they are being seen another representative of these Islamic networks. And finally, how these final point is another sample to explain how a modern networks help the movement. It is protecting the movement from political divisions. Every society is politically divided, not only non-Western societies, even very Western societies such as Belgium, even USA. So there's a problem of protecting yourself from this politically divided society, from these controversial perspectives. So since the agent of the movement operates through daily life, it is the classroom or the market, not again referring to the institutional aspect of modernity, so political divisions also are not a clear-cut challenge to the agent of the movement. I think this is the final. There are some others, but in the interest of time, I have limited myself on these 4 points. So what this presentation says basically, of course we are living in modern era, but the idea of the assumption of modernity covering all aspects of social life should be criticized. And I think the sample of Gülen is a great opportunity to analyze this, how it takes place practically, not taking place pure at theoretical level. And when one reads the text of Gülen, I think comparatively, instead of modern perspectives, he reminds more us about the canonical and traditional texts written by Al-Jilani or Ghazali. And as a conclusion, maybe a quite controversial point, while reading this, while writing this paper, I noticed that Said Nursi was also very influential, and his collection of books, so-called Risale-i Nur, also should be named as another source of a modernity onto the movement, because Risale-i Nur is not also a modern text. It is not a modern text. But interestingly, the relationship between Risale-i Nur and the movement is quite controversial. For example, I noticed that during these field studies, compared with, for example, 10 years ago, somehow it is interestingly, Risale-i Nur has become, I don't want to use that, but less important or something like that. So this brings me whether there are some modern demands in the movement, or the movement after a point is becoming to come up with some kind of also modern demands to clash its own a modern identity. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.